In 1986, I walked away from Fort Riley with my discharge papers in hand, leaving the Army behind to return to my hometown in the Kansas flatlands. A faded scar, a memento from a bomb disposal training exercise gone wrong, traced a pale line from my left shoulder down to my elbow. The old farmhouses of my youth, single-story clapboard structures, sagged against the relentless sky. Inside, they were mostly empty, furnished with little more than a rickety metal bed frame and a warped wooden dresser pushed against a cracked plaster wall. My aging mother was frail, her body worn down by a chronic stomach ulcer and the swollen, aching joints of arthritis that made farm work impossible. We were dirt poor, and I had to find work immediately to put food on the table for the two of us. Thanks to my status as a newly discharged veteran, I landed a position as a mechanic's assistant at the Quit Thung Farmers Cooperative Workshop. My daily grind consisted of maintaining and repairing the co-op's aging fleet, the water pumps, the grain augers, and a few battered Ford farm trucks that seemed held together by rust and sheer will. I was quiet by nature, a man of few words, and the disciplined routine of the Army had become ingrained in me. I kept my head down, did the work assigned, and completed every task without complaint. My direct supervisor was a man named Tuan, the only son of the co-op chairman. He was my age, but his soft, pale skin and slender frame told the story of a life spent far from the sun and hard labor. He was always dressed in a crisply ironed button-down shirt, a fountain pen clipped neatly in the chest pocket, a cigarette dangling perpetually from his lips. Riding on his father's coattails, Tuan treated the workshop as his personal fiefdom, wielding his minor authority like a king. My quiet diligence, my refusal to engage in the customary brown-nosing, became a thorn in his side. He despised anyone who didn't flatter him and constantly looked for excuses to criticize me for the most trivial mistakes. One Monday morning, a severely damaged D8 diesel generator was hauled into the shop. It was a wreck. A thick layer of black grease and rust coated every surface, seizing the joints. The engine block was caked in dried mud, and the combustion chamber was choked with a thick, hard layer of carbon soot. Tuan stood in the middle of the workshop, hands on his hips, and barked my name. He gestured to the derelict machine and gave me an impossible order. I was to completely dismantle the entire engine, scrub every part clean of rust and grime, clear the fuel injectors, replace the pistons, and reseat the valves. And I was to have it all done by the end of the day. It was a job that would have taken 3 skilled mechanics 2 full days. I said nothing. I simply picked up my toolbox, walked to a corner of the yard, and laid out my wrenches, spanners, a steel hammer, and a can of kerosene on the dusty ground. I started on the bolts, one by one. The ones on the exhaust manifold were fused solid by heat and rust. I had to strike the head of the wrench sharply with the hammer several times, then soak the bolt in kerosene for a few minutes before I could finally break it loose. Piece by piece, I disassembled the engine block, pulled the cylinders, and pried out the piston rings, greasing and setting aside each component. My hands were stained a deep, greasy black, and sweat soaked the back of my worn-out work shirt. Tuan paced back and forth, occasionally kicking a loose part, and making snide remarks about my slow pace. I ignored his taunts, focusing on the task at hand, using a piece of sandpaper to meticulously clean the carbon buildup from the valve heads, then concentrating on calibrating the timing of the camshaft with millimeter precision. Early that afternoon, a young woman named Lian appeared at the workshop door. Lian was the daughter of Mr. Herr, the respected schoolteacher from the north side of town. She was known as the local beauty, with long, dark hair braided down her back and a delicate oval face. Her family's old Singer sewing machine had a broken drive shaft, and she'd brought it to the co-op to see if a mechanic could weld it back together. The moment he saw her, Tuan flicked his half-smoked cigarette away, clapped the dust from his hands, and rushed over to greet her. He was all charm, inviting her in for a glass of water, boasting about his imminent promotion to the co-op's management board. Lian offered a polite smile, placed the broken shaft on a workbench, and explained that she needed it fixed quickly to finish a batch of clothes for a client in the next county. Tuan picked up the small metal rod, squinted at it, and shook his head. He claimed the break was tricky, that the workshop's welder was broken, and told her to come back in 3 days. Hearing this, Lian's face fell. Her client was pressing her for the delivery, and every day of delay would cost her money. From where I sat, not far away, I'd heard the entire exchange. I put down the engine crank I was cleaning, walked to the wash basin, and scrubbed the thickest layer of grease from my hands with a coarse cloth. I walked over to the workbench, took the broken shaft from Tuan, and examined the clean brake. It was brass, only about a 1/4 inch in diameter. It could easily be repaired with a simple brazing torch and some flux, no need for the shop's heavy-duty arc welder. "Wait 15 minutes, I said to Liane, my voice flat. I went back to my workspace. I took the small coal forge I was using to heat stubborn parts and stuck the tip of a copper soldering iron into the glowing embers. Next, I clamped the 2 halves of the drive shaft into a bench vise and used a file to bevel the edges of the brake, creating a V-shaped groove. I sprinkled a little borax flux onto the surface to clean off the oxidation. Then, with the glowing hot soldering iron, I melted a stick of brass brazing rod along the groove. The molten metal filled the gap, cooled and solidified, creating a strong, seamless bond. I used a fine grit sandpaper to polish the new joint until it was perfectly smooth to the touch, ensuring that thread wouldn't snag or break when the machine was running. I handed the repaired shaft back to Liane, then turned back to my engine without another word. As she took it, her gaze fell on the long, pale scar on my arm. She nodded, her eyes conveying a silent thank you. My quick, efficient work had not gone unnoticed by her. Tuan, however, stood fuming, his face dark with resentment. He yelled at me to get back to my post and stop wasting time on unauthorized side jobs. Seeing his hostility, Liane quickly put the shaft in her bag, said a brief goodbye, and hurried out of the workshop. That evening, Tuan made me stay late, forcing me to sort and clean every piece of scrap metal and every rusty bolt in the storage shed. It was well past dark before he finally let me go home. By mid-June of 1986, a suffocating heat wave had settled over the Midwest. The sky remained a cloudless, searing blue for days on end, the air thick and stagnant. One morning, the co-op dispatched me to Coyote Ridge, a remote farming community 15 miles away, deep in the Flint Hills. The journey required me to load up my bicycle with a tool bag that weighed nearly 50 pounds. The irrigation pump at the ridge had failed, and the spring corn crop, just beginning to tassel, was in desperate need of water. The fields were already cracking, the dry earth split into a mosaic of fissures. I pedaled my old Schwinn, its frame groaning and its worn-out chain clattering, up the winding red dirt roads. The pump station was a lonely concrete blockhouse in the middle of a vast field. I unscrewed the motor's cover plate and used a multimeter to check the wiring. The starter capacitor was fried, its paper insulation blackened and burst. A few windings on the starter coil had also broken. It took me over 4 hours of painstaking work, removing the burnt coil, replacing the capacitor, rewinding the copper wire, and finally, using an ohm meter to check for any current leaks. Once I was satisfied, I tightened the last bolt and threw the main breaker. The pump roared to life with a steady hum. Its impeller blades began to spin, drawing water from the river and sending it gushing through the main pipe into the irrigation ditches. It was around 4 p.m. when I packed up my tools and started the long ride back. I had just left Coyote Ridge when the sky began to change. Dark, bruised-looking clouds rolled in from the west, swallowing the sun and casting the landscape into an eerie twilight. The wind tore through the trees, bending the tall cottonwoods and whipping dried leaves and dust into the air. 10 minutes later, the sky cracked open. A deafening clap of thunder echoed across the hills, followed by a bolt of lightning that lit up the horizon. The rain came down in a torrential, blinding sheet. A prairie thunderstorm had hit with sudden, violent force. The downpour turned the red dirt road into a slick, treacherous river of mud. My bicycle's wheels kept sliding out from under me, and the thick, clay-like mud packed itself into the space between the frame and the tires, locking them up completely. The brakes were useless, clogged with grit. I had no choice but to get off and walk. I slung the heavy tool bag, which I'd wrapped in a plastic sheet, over my shoulder, and began the arduous task of dragging the bike through the mud, step by agonizing step, under the relentless rain. With every step, my boots sank deep into the mire, and I had to strain to pull them free before taking the next. After about 3 miles, I reached a steep incline known locally as Crow's Beak Hill. It was the most dangerous part of the road, a narrow track with high, sheer dirt banks on either side, overgrown with weeds. Water streamed down the banks, carving deep gullies into the road's surface. As I struggled to push my mud-caked bike up the slope, my eyes caught something out of place. A tattered straw sun hat lying half submerged in a rivulet of water at the side of the road. Its brim was broken. Looking closer, into a thicket of ferns just off the road, I saw a figure huddled on the ground, curled into a ball against the lashing rain. I immediately dropped my bike, letting it fall into a ditch, tossed my tool bag aside, and scrambled through the undergrowth. It was Leanne. She was wearing a simple brown blouse that was soaked through and clung to her body, her black linen pants caked in mud. She had been coming back from a market in the next town and had been caught in the storm on this desolate stretch of road. I knelt in the mud beside her and gently turned her over. Her face was deathly pale, her lips a frightening shade of blue. Her eyes were closed, and her teeth were chattering uncontrollably from the cold. I quickly scanned her body for injuries, and my eyes locked onto her right calf. Her pant leg was torn, revealing a section of her leg that was already swelling, the skin stretched taut and shiny. In the middle of the swollen area were two small, deep puncture wounds, less than an inch apart. The flesh around the bites was turning a dark, purplish black, and a trickle of bloody fluid oozed from the wounds, mixing with the rain. The signs were unmistakable. The two fang marks, the rapid swelling, the localized tissue death. She had been bitten by a mature timber rattlesnake. The snake's hemotoxic venom was acting fast, destroying her blood cells and attacking the tissues of her circulatory system. The severe swelling indicated the venom was breaking down the muscle membranes, traveling up through her veins, heading directly for her heart. Her breathing was becoming shallow, her pulse faint. Her limbs twitched with small, involuntary convulsions as the venom began to affect her nervous system. She was losing consciousness. She no longer responded when I shook her shoulder. We were in the middle of nowhere, in a torrential downpour, at least 3 miles from the nearest clinic. The window of time to save her life was closing, measured now in minutes. Any delay meant the venom would reach her heart. My years of training on the battlefield, of providing first aid to soldiers hit by shrapnel or bitten by venomous creatures, kicked in. My mind became cold and clear, pushing aside all panic. The first priority was to stop the venom's spread to her heart. I didn't have a medical tourniquet. I grabbed the collar of my sturdy canvas work shirt with both hands and, with a powerful jerk, ripped a long strip of fabric from the hem. I twisted the fabric into a tight rope and tied it as a tourniquet around her right thigh, about a hand's width above the knee, well above the bite. I tightened it, just enough to constrict the superficial veins, slowing the venomous blood's return to the heart, but left it just loose enough for the deeper femoral artery to continue supplying blood to the lower leg, to prevent the tissue from dying completely. Tourniquet secured. I scrambled back to my tool bag and rummaged through it until I found my electrician's knife, a small blade with a yellow plastic handle that I kept razor sharp for stripping wire. I pulled out the small bottle of rubbing alcohol I used for cleaning electronic components. I poured half of it over the knife blade to sterilize it, and the other half directly onto the 2 fang marks on her leg. Holding her calf firmly with my left hand to keep it steady, I took the knife and made 2 decisive, deep incisions, one over each fang mark, intersecting to form a small cross. The blade sank through the swollen skin into the soft tissue beneath. A dark, blackish blood, mixed with air bubbles, immediately welled up from the cuts. Without a second's hesitation, I bent down, placed my mouth directly over the wounds, and began to suck, drawing the venomous blood out with all my strength. My mouth filled with a foul, metallic taste, mingled with the grit of mud. I turned my head and spat the dark fluid onto the ground, then immediately put my mouth back to the wound and sucked again. I repeated this process dozens of times, the mechanical suction pulling the thick, venom-laden blood from her tissues. I continued relentlessly, until the blood flowing from the cuts began to turn from a dark purple to a normal, bright red. It was a sign that I had removed most of the venom concentrated at the site. Only then did I stop. I spat out the last mouthful of blood and tilted my head back, rinsing my mouth with the clean rainwater pouring from the sky, clearing the last traces of venom from my throat and teeth. But even though I had dealt with the immediate threat of the venom, another, equally dangerous medical complication was developing. Rattlesnake venom contains enzymes that destroy tissue, causing an extreme inflammatory response. Lian's calf was now swollen to nearly twice its normal size, the muscle beneath as hard as wood. The narrow cut of her linen pants was now acting like a vice, squeezing the swelling leg and constricting the blood vessels and muscles inside. I could see the veins bulging against the wet fabric. My medic training screamed a warning in my head: compartment syndrome. When a muscle swells rapidly within a confined space, constricted by clothing or the body's own fascia, the pressure builds catastrophically, cutting off blood flow from the arteries. Without blood, the muscle tissue begins to die. If the pressure wasn't released, her entire lower leg would become necrotic. Doctors would have no choice but to amputate to save her life from a systemic infection. The only solution was to release the pressure immediately. I picked up my electrician's knife again. I carefully inserted the tip of the blade into the tiny gap between the taut fabric and her swollen skin, angling the sharp edge away from her. Then, with one swift, upward motion, I ripped the fabric open. With a sound like tearing canvas, the pant leg split open from her ankle all the way to her knee, exposing the pale, discolored skin beneath. As soon as the pressure was released, her calf seemed to swell even more, but the blood vessels were no longer in danger of bursting. Color began to slowly return to the skin as blood from the femoral artery, past the tourniquet, started to flow more freely into the tissues below. Having completed the emergency medical procedures, I tore the rest of my shirt into strips and loosely bandaged the incisions to control the bleeding, preparing to move her. The rain was falling harder now, and small flash floods were washing away the road, carrying mud and debris. The water was already ankle-deep. I glanced at my bicycle, half swallowed by a muddy ditch, its wheels hopelessly jammed. It was useless. I scanned the area, calculating the distance back to town and my own physical limits. I made a decision. I would leave everything behind, the bicycle and my heavy tool bag, filled with my livelihood of wrenches, hammers, and sockets. The most critical thing now was to get her to a clinic for an anti-venom shot before the remaining venom in her system could cause irreversible damage to her organs. I crouched in the mud, slipped my arms under her armpits, and heaved her limp body onto my back. The weight of an adult woman, compounded by her waterlogged clothes, was immense. I wrapped my arms around her thighs, securing her legs, and pulled her body tight against mine. I adjusted my stance, took a deep breath, and used the power in my legs to stand up. Finding my balance on the slick, treacherous ground, I lowered my head against the driving rain and began to walk, taking long, deliberate strides. With every step, I had to dig my toes into the mud for grip. One slip, and we would both go tumbling down the steep ravine that bordered the road. The 3-mile journey back to town became a grueling test of endurance. The rain lashed at my face, blurring my vision. My breath came in ragged gasps. My thigh and calf muscles burned with every step up the slick, muddy inclines. Rainwater mixed with sweat, stinging my eyes. On my back, Lian remained unconscious, her head lolling against my shoulder, her faint heartbeat a fragile rhythm against my back. Every so often, I would have to readjust her weight, hiking her higher up to fight off the fatigue, keeping my breathing steady with each step. The skills I learned on long, forced marches in the army, carrying a full pack through unforgiving terrain, helped me maintain a steady pace for over an hour through the raging storm. It was nearly 6 p.m. when I finally staggered into the gravel courtyard of the county clinic. The wooden door to the waiting room was shut tight against the storm. I didn't hesitate. I kicked it open with my foot and yelled for the doctor. An elderly man in glasses. Doctor Miller came hurrying out from a back room, stumbling in shock at the sight of me. A man covered head to toe in mud, carrying an unconscious young woman. I walked straight to a vinyl examination cot in the corner, gently laid Lian down, and pulled a thin blanket over her. Wiping the rain from my face with the back of my hand, I gave the doctor a rapid, concise summary of her condition, using the basic medical terms I knew. Rattlesnake bite, right calf, about an hour ago. I applied a tourniquet to the thigh to slow venous return, made incisions, and suctioned the wound. Severe swelling and compartment syndrome, so I had to cut her pants to release the pressure. She needs antivenom and IV fluids now. The doctor nodded, his face grim. He grabbed a pair of surgical scissors, cut away my makeshift bandage, and began cleaning the wound with iodine. He then turned to a glass cabinet to prepare a syringe of antivenom. Seeing that Lian was now in capable hands, her pulse weak but steady, I turned and walked toward the door. The doctor called after me, telling me to stay, to fill out paperwork, to wait for her family. I just waved a hand in dismissal, grabbed the tattered straw hat from the table, and stepped back out into the deluge. At home, my mother was lying in bed, fighting a wave of pain from her ulcer. Today was the day she was supposed to take the last dose of a special herbal medicine an old folk healer had prescribed. I couldn't wait another minute. I ran the last mile home through the muddy lanes, arriving as darkness fell. My clothes were caked in mud. I went straight to the kitchen, knelt by the old wood stove, and used a handful of dry kindling I kept in a corner to start a fire. I poured 3 cups of rainwater into a small clay pot, added the dried roots and herbs, and set it on the stove to boil. As it simmered, I pumped water from the well outside and sluiced the thickest mud from my body, changed into dry clothes, and watched the pot until the liquid had reduced to a single cup. I poured the dark, steaming medicine into a ceramic bowl and carried it upstairs to my mother, making sure she drank it on time. Back on Crow's Beak Hill, as the rain began to let up, Tuan was riding his Honda dirt bike down the same road, on his way to collect a debt in a neighboring town. The thick mud clogged his wheels, and the engine screamed and belched black smoke as it struggled to move. Cursing, he got off and started pushing the heavy bike. As he navigated a particularly slick patch, his eyes fell on a familiar sight: my old Schwinn bicycle and my green canvas tool bag lying in a muddy ditch by the side of the road. Curious, he propped his bike up and used a flashlight to follow the jumbled footprints in the soft mud. They led him to the thicket where I had found Lien. There, he found her straw hat, crushed and muddy, and a piece of black linen fabric, a torn pant leg lying on the ground, stained with mud and dried blood. He connected the dots. He remembered seeing me earlier, from a distance, carrying Lien on my back, running towards the clinic, both of us soaked and disheveled. A cruel, malicious smile spread across Tuan's face. An evil idea took root in his petty mind. He carefully picked up the torn fabric and the hat, wrapped them in a plastic bag, stuffed it into his saddlebag, and kicked his bike to life, heading straight for the schoolteacher's house. He screeched to a halt in their yard and began shouting for Lien's parents, creating a scene. He then spun a complete and utter fabrication, a vile story designed to destroy my reputation. He told them, his voice filled with false urgency, that he'd been riding by Crow's Beak Hill when he heard a woman's screams. He claimed he'd rushed into the woods and seen me with his own eyes, attacking Lien, holding a knife to her, tearing her clothes off in the middle of the woods. He added a heroic flourish, claiming that he had bravely intervened, shouting and scaring me off. He said I'd only taken her to the clinic as a cover story, to pretend I was helping her after my assault was interrupted. As his proof, he dramatically produced the torn, muddy piece of her pants and her crushed hat. The Her family was thrown into chaos. Lien's mother dropped a bowl she was holding, collapsing to the ground in a fit of sobs. She grabbed the hat and ran out the door, heading for the clinic to see what had become of her daughter. Mr. Hu, a man who had spent his life teaching history and valued honor and integrity above all else, was incensed. His face flushed a deep red, the veins in his neck and temples bulging with rage. Forgetting all propriety, he stormed to his woodshed, grabbed a thick hickory axe handle, and called for his 3 brothers, all middle-aged, formidable men. Together they marched, full of righteous fury, straight to my house. That evening, I had just finished helping my mother with her medicine, and was washing dishes by the well, when I heard the dogs in the neighborhood start barking wildly. Mr. Her and his brothers kicked open my flimsy fence gate and stormed into my yard. But this wasn't the usual drunken bravado of a small-town fight. This was the cold, focused rage of a family wronged. Mr. Her slammed the axe handle down on the ground. He pointed a trembling finger in my face, his voice cracking with fury. "Stone, what did my daughter ever do to you? How could you do that to her? You tore her clothes off. You shamed her. You dragged our family's name through the mud. You call yourself a veteran, a man who served his country, and you do something this disgusting? You think because you're strong you can prey on a helpless girl?" His brothers chimed in, hurling the most vicious insults they could think of. They demanded to know why I had cut her pants, why I had taken her to the clinic only to sneak away like a coward if I wasn't guilty and afraid of the sheriff. Lying in her bed, my mother heard the shouting. She pulled herself up, her face pale with fear, and peered out the window. The shock sent a fresh wave of pain through her stomach, and she cried out, clutching her abdomen. I set down the dish I was washing and walked calmly into the center of the yard. My work clothes were still stained with mud. Faced with their furious accusations, I felt no fear, and I offered no defense. The army had taught me that you don't argue with a mob that has lost its reason. My actions were medical necessities, the incisions to fight the venom, cutting the pants to prevent tissue death. The truth of that would be borne out by the science, by Leon's survival, and by Dr. Miller. I stood silently, my jaw clenched, my hands at my sides, as Mr. Herr continued to scream his accusations. Outside the small circle of our confrontation, the rain began to fall again, tapping a somber rhythm on the tin roof. At the clinic, Leon's mother burst through the door and rushed to her daughter's bedside. She saw Leon lying peacefully, the color returning to her cheeks. She threw her arms around her daughter, sobbing with relief and anguish. Then, she checked her daughter's clothes and saw it. The right leg of her black pants was gone, sliced from ankle to thigh, revealing a clean white medical bandage wrapped around her calf. Certain that Tuan's story was true, she turned on Dr. Miller, berating him for his slow response and demanding he call the sheriff to arrest the man who had assaulted her daughter. The old doctor, who had been cleaning his instruments, looked up, his brow furrowed in annoyance. He slammed a stainless steel tray down on a metal table, the sharp clang silencing her. He pointed a stern finger at Leon's bandaged leg and explained, in clear, simple terms, the medical reality of the situation. He described how the rattlesnake venom caused massive swelling, how the muscle was expanding so rapidly it was crushing all the blood vessels in her leg. Her tight-fitting pants were acting like a deadly vice, cutting off the blood supply. If the young man who brought her in hadn't had the presence of mind to cut the fabric away and release that pressure, Leon's entire lower leg would have died. She would have faced certain amputation. That young man, Dr. Miller said, his voice firm, used combat medic skills to save your daughter's life. He applied a tourniquet correctly. He suctioned the venom. And cutting her pants wasn't an assault. It was a life-saving surgical decision. You shouldn't be screaming for his arrest. You should be down on your knees thanking him for saving your daughter's life and her leg. Leon's mother stood frozen, the straw hat falling from her numb fingers. The truth hit her like a physical blow. She understood Tuan's cruel, manipulative lie. Just then, thanks to the antivenom and IV fluids, Leon began to stir. Lying in her bed, she had heard the entire conversation between her mother and the doctor. Remembering my decisive actions in the storm, she was horrified to hear her mother say that her father had gone to my house to confront me. She grabbed her mother's hand, her voice weak but clear. She recounted every detail. How I had put my own mouth to the wound to suck out the venom, how I had torn my own shirt to make a tourniquet, and how I had cut her pants to save her from a crippling injury. Tears streamed down her face as she begged her mother to go home, to stop her father before he did something terrible, before he repaid a debt of life with an act of injustice. Jolted into action, Leon's mother left her daughter in the doctor's care, grabbed the hat, and ran back out into the rainy night. She arrived at my house just as Mr. Herr was leveling his most furious accusations at me. She burst through the crowd of men, breathless, and snatched the axe handle from her husband's hand. In a torrent of words, she relayed what she had learned from the doctor, the medical facts that exposed Tuan's vicious lie. She told them what Leon had said, her voice breaking with emotion. Leon's last words to me were, "He saved my life, Mom. If you and Dad dishonor him, I won't be able to live with the shame." The crowd of relatives fell silent, looking at each other with dawning embarrassment. Mr. Herr stood stunned, his arms hanging limply at his sides. The truth, combined with the doctor's medical explanation, completely deflated his rage. Humiliation and profound regret washed over Leon's parents. To make amends, to silence the vicious rumors Tuan had started, and above all, to repay the debt they now understood they owed me, Mr. Herr did something extraordinary. He cleared his throat, swallowed his pride, and stepped forward. He took my hand and, in front of everyone, he announced that he would be honored for me to take his daughter as my wife, to make up for the terrible wrong his family had done me. He told me to pick a date, to have an elder come and speak for me, and that his family would waive any expectation of a dowry or elaborate ceremony. With that, he led his shamed family away, leaving me standing alone in the muddy yard, soaked by the rain. Our wedding, held on a crisp autumn day, was a simple, impoverished affair, typical of that difficult era. As instructed, I asked an old, respected farmer to speak for me. I brought a simple offering, a carton of cigarettes, a bottle of whiskey, and a box of shotgun shells. Despite the town's gossip about the disparity between a poor, veteran mechanic and the schoolteacher's beautiful daughter, Mr. Herr kept his word. The ceremony was quick and unadorned. No fancy reception, no band. I wore my old, faded army dress uniform, my veteran's pin on the lapel, and walked across town to the Herr's house. Leon wore a simple white blouse and a black skirt she had made herself. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers and walked beside me back to my dilapidated house, a handful of close family wishing us well. My small two-bedroom house, already showing its age, seemed even more threadbare with a new person in it. The wedding meal for our families consisted of a single platter of thinly sliced roasted pork, a casserole of green beans, and a bowl of mashed potatoes. We washed the dishes and saw our guests off as dusk settled. Our wedding night was anything but romantic. A sudden downpour began, and the old tin roof, rusted in many places, began to leak. Water dripped onto the floorboards, creating small puddles in the dark room. I quickly got out of bed, lit an old kerosene lamp, and ran to the kitchen. I grabbed a dented aluminum basin and a plastic bucket patched with tar and placed them under the worst of the drips. The sound of water striking metal became a steady, rhythmic beat. One of the leaks was spreading towards our bed. I had to brace my back against the wall and push the heavy iron bed frame to a drier corner of the room. Our mattress was a thin pad on wooden slats, and our only blanket was a threadbare wool one I'd brought back from the army. I used an old broom to sweep the puddles of water out the front door. Rain blew in through the cracks in the walls, soaking a corner of the old wooden chest where Leon kept her clothes. I found a plastic tarp and covered the chest, weighing it down with bricks. All of this happened in silence, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and the chirping of crickets. After I had done all I could to manage the leaks, I washed the mud from my feet and dried them with a discolored towel. When I returned to the bed, Leanne was sitting huddled in a corner, her eyes taking in the leaky roof and the bare, damp room. The air was heavy with the sound of the rain. I sat down beside her and awkwardly put my arm around her thin shoulders. My hand, rough and calloused from years of working with tools, felt coarse against the soft fabric of her blouse. In the flickering lamplight, I looked into her eyes. There were no sweet nothings, no flowery promises. I spoke in my usual low, steady voice, making a vow with the simple honor of a soldier. "I promise," I said, "I will work with these two hands. You will never have to live like this for the rest of your life." She leaned her head against my shoulder and smiled, her own silent promise in return. We sat there for a long time, leaning against the damp wall, listening to the rain drip into the buckets, beginning our life together with nothing but each other. In the difficult economic climate of the mid-80s farm crisis, the burden of providing for a new family fell heavily on my shoulders. Back at the co-op workshop, Tuan, his scheme to ruin me having failed spectacularly, now saw the woman he'd desired become my wife. His resentment festered into a crazed obsession with revenge. Using his authority as foreman, he assigned me the most grueling and dangerous jobs. Instead of routine maintenance, he tasked me with restoring the entire chassis and transmission of a massive, derelict MTZ-50 Soviet-era tractor that had been rusting in the scrapyard for years. It was an impossible task, designed to make me quit. The colossal machine, weighing several tons, was a monument to decay. Its bearings were shattered, its gears stripped, and the mixture of mud and hardened grease was as solid as rock. I didn't complain. I took a sledgehammer and a crowbar out to the yard and began the battle. The axle bolts were as thick as my fist, fused shut by rust. I had to use an acetylene torch to heat the surrounding metal, making it expand, then fit a huge socket wrench with a 6-foot pipe as a lever. I had to put my entire body weight on the pipe, bouncing on it, just to break the bolts free. When bolts snapped off inside the engine block, I had to use a hardened steel drill bit to drill them out, then use a tap and die set to rethread the holes. Metal shavings flew into my face, and the black, sticky grease worked its way into every pore, impossible to wash out. I disassembled the transmission, laying each gear out on a tarp. The teeth on many of them were chipped from years of abuse. Using a ball-peen hammer and a steel punch, I painstakingly reshaped the damaged teeth, then used a hand grinder to smooth the contact surfaces. Calibrating the clutch was the most physically demanding part. I had to crawl underneath the massive tractor, balance the heavy transmission block on my shoulders, and use my free hands to evenly tighten the 6 pressure plate bolts. Grease dripped from the casing onto my forehead and into my eyes, stinging them. Every adjustment had to be perfect. A millimeter of misalignment would cause the entire transmission to seize up. For days on end, I labored under that metal beast, pulling out snapped brake lines, fabricating new bushings on the shop's old lathe. Tuan would often stroll by, taunting me, cutting my supply requisitions, forcing me to scavenge scrap metal to forge my own replacement parts. I gritted my teeth and worked, ignoring him, focused only on getting the job done so I could collect the meager pay, a few pounds of flour, and a handful of dollars to take home to my family. At home, Lian was my rock. She never complained about our poverty. Using the old Singer machine I had repaired, she started a small business mending clothes for our neighbors. She worked from dawn until late at night, the rhythmic whir of the machine a constant presence in our small house. With the few dollars she earned, she would buy a little bit of bacon to flavor our meals, or a tin of tobacco for my mother. Our meals were often just potatoes and cornbread, but Lian always made sure they were presented with care, always saving the best portions for my mother and me. Our life was built on my sweat and grime from the workshop and her silent tears of exhaustion as she sewed through the night, but it forged a powerful bond between us, a strength that helped us endure the darkest times. Just as we were starting to find a rhythm, to save a few dollars here and there, disaster struck. My mother's chronic ulcer suddenly took a turn for the worse. One morning, she collapsed in the yard, writhing in agony, her face a ghastly white. She began vomiting a dark black substance mixed with fresh blood. Her body was cold and clammy, her abdomen rigid as a board. I rushed her to the county clinic. After a quick examination, Dr. Miller shook his head, his face grave. He told me her stomach had perforated, a large hole had burst open, and stomach acid was flooding her abdominal cavity, causing a massive infection called peritonitis. The small clinic was not equipped for major surgery. The only way to save her life was to get her to the regional hospital in the city immediately for emergency surgery, to patch the hole and clean out her abdomen. The cost of the surgery and the hospital stay was astronomical, a fortune for a family that lived hand to mouth. I went home to gather our savings. I opened the small metal box where we kept our money and dumped it all out on the bed. I counted the worn, wrinkled bills over and over. The total wasn't even enough to pay for the bus ride to the city, let alone a major surgery. I reached into the pocket of my work pants and pulled out the only other money I had, a single, tattered $5 bill torn in half and taped back together. It was everything we had left in the world. The crushing weight of poverty felt like it was suffocating me. I clenched the $5 bill in my fist, the veins on the back of my hand standing out, helpless as I watched Lian cry softly by my mother's bedside. My mother's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her blood pressure was plummeting, her lips turning blue. The doctor had given her a high dose of morphine and started 2 IV lines to keep her from going into shock, to keep her alive, hour by hour. Outside, a storm of historic proportions was bearing down on our county. It rained for 3 days and 3 nights without stopping. The rivers swelled, and the smaller levees broke, submerging hundreds of acres of corn that were just weeks from harvest. The entire community's livelihood was about to be washed away. The town's only hope was the massive drainage pump station on the main levee. It was a system of 3 powerful, 50-kilowatt, 3-phase electric pumps that could, in theory, drain the floodwaters and save the crops. But in the middle of the night, at the height of the storm, a massive explosion echoed from the pump station, followed by a brilliant blue flash that lit up the sky. The pumps went silent. The main underground 3-phase power cable that ran from the transformer to the control panel had shorted out, flooded by the rising water. The co-op chairman and the town council called in every electrician in the area, but no one would touch it. Working with 380-volt 3-phase power in a flooded environment was a death sentence. One mistake, and anyone standing in the water would be electrocuted instantly. The power company engineers from the city were cut off by flooded and washed-out roads. The floodwaters were rising by the hour, threatening to breach the main levee. Panic set in at the town hall. The co-op chairman, Tuan's father, paced back and forth, sweating profusely despite the cold rain. The local electricians huddled in a corner, shaking their heads, refusing to go near the flooded trench that held the main power line. All attempts to reach outside help were futile. Seeing no other way, with nothing left to lose, I grabbed my green canvas tool bag and walked into the town hall meeting. Dripping wet, I strode to the front of the room, to the table where the chairman sat. I slammed a heavy steel wrench down on the tabletop, the loud crack silencing the room. In a clear, steady voice, I announced that I could fix the underground cable and restart the pumps that night. In return, I had one condition. The co-op had to immediately advance me the cash to pay for my mother's emergency surgery at the regional hospital. A murmur went through the room. Tuan, standing next to his father, sneered. "A grease monkey thinks he can handle high-voltage electrical work?" he scoffed, and started to lunge at me. I brushed him aside. I grabbed a piece of paper and a pen, and quickly sketched out the pump station's electrical layout. I pointed to the exact spot, a sharp bend in the underground conduit where the cable had most likely failed due to mechanical stress and water ingress. I looked directly at the other electricians and said I would personally climb the utility pole and disconnect the station from the main grid to ensure everyone's safety. The other electricians looked at my sketch and nodded. They knew my proposed direct splice repair was the only viable option given the lack of proper materials. Their professional consensus undercut Tuan's objections and forced the chairman's hand. Faced with the loss of the entire town's harvest and the quiet confidence of a former army engineer who had set up field generators in far worse conditions, the chairman had no choice. He took a set of keys, opened a large iron safe, and pulled out a thick stack of cash. He ordered the co-op's accountant to count out the full amount for the surgery and give it to Lien, who was waiting anxiously outside. With the money in her hand, Lien immediately arranged for a neighbor with a high-clearance truck to take my mother to a nearby town, where they could be transferred to an ambulance for the trip to the city. I had entrusted my mother's life to my wife. Now, I had to risk my own. I walked out of the town hall and headed for the pump station in the driving rain. I waded through the darkness, the wind tearing at me. The pump station was at the base of the levee, and the floodwater was already knee-deep inside the building. Holding a plastic-wrapped flashlight in my teeth, I carefully made my way to the main control panel, a man-sized steel cabinet. The water was already touching the insulated base. I swung open the cabinet doors and was hit by the acrid smell of burnt plastic and ozone. The 380-volt starter assemblies were soaked, covered in a film of mud. First, I had to kill the power. I climbed the slick concrete utility pole outside, used a long insulated hook stick to open the 3 main cutout fuses, and severed the flow of electricity to the station. Back inside, I began the long process of drying the equipment. I didn't have a heat gun, so I used a small kerosene blowtorch. I lit the torch, adjusted the flame to a low, steady heat, and began methodically passing it over the ceramic insulators, the copper bus bars, and the contactor coils. Steam rose in a thick cloud. As I worked, I used a rag soaked in alcohol to wipe away the carbon scoring from every contact point. This required immense patience. A single drop of water left on an insulator would cause the 380-volt current to arc, destroying the entire system the moment I threw the switch. After nearly 3 hours of this meticulous work, I took out my megometer to test the insulation resistance. I clipped one lead to the grounded cabinet and touched the other to each phase of the motor windings. I cranked the handle on the meter, and the needle jumped, showing the resistance was high enough. The motor's internal windings were still dry. I finished by wrapping the terminal boxes in plastic and sealing them with electrical tape. Now for the main problem. Following the diagram I had drawn, I waded into the drainage ditch behind the station. The break was at a sharp 90-degree bend, submerged under 2 feet of muddy, flowing water. I plunged my arms into the frigid water, digging through the muck until my fingers found a thick, rubbery mass. It was the cable. I braced myself and heaved the heavy, armored cable to the surface. The outer PVC jacket was blown apart, and the steel armor was shredded, exposing the 3 thick, burnt copper cores. Splicing it would be a nightmare without the proper waterproof junction box and high-voltage tape. I would have to improvise. I used a hacksaw to cut away the damaged sections of the cable. Then, I used my knife to strip about a foot of insulation from each end, exposing the gleaming copper strands. The cable was nearly 2 inches thick, as stiff as rebar. It was impossible to twist together by hand. I laid the two ends of one phase overlapping each other. Then I took a large, 32mm combination wrench from my tool bag, a single piece of forged steel. I used the box end of the wrench to clamp the two overlapping copper cores together. Then, I took a roll of rubber from an old bicycle inner tube that I always carried and began wrapping it tightly, over and over, around the wrench and the copper cable. The mechanical pressure from the stretched rubber squeezed the wrench and the cables together, creating a solid, physical bridge for the electricity to flow. The thick layers of rubber would act as a temporary insulator, but dropping the splice back into the water would be suicide. The rubber wasn't perfectly waterproof. A 3-phase short in the water would cause a massive explosion. I pulled a sturdy fence post from the mud at the edge of the ditch and hammered it deep into the bank. I used a length of rope to hoist the entire spliced section of the heavy cable out of the water, tying it to the post. The splice, clamped by the steel wrench, now hung suspended in the air, 1.5 feet above the floodwater, safely insulated from the ground. With the deadly trap set, I climbed onto a dry concrete wall, 2 meters above the water, to avoid any step potential if things went wrong. Bracing myself against a window frame, I yelled to the co-op worker I had stationed at the utility pole to close the fuses. There was a loud bang and a shower of blue sparks as the massive inrush current from the 50-kilowatt motors hit the makeshift splice. The steel wrench, carrying hundreds of amps, began to glow red through the layers of rubber. But it held. The connection didn't short out. Inside the station, the relays slammed shut, and with a shudder and a roar, the 3 massive pumps came to life. Water began to gush from the discharge pipes, pouring into the main river channel. The pump station was operational. The floodwaters would recede. I stood on the wall, watching the water being pushed back, and suddenly the tension in my muscles released. A wave of exhaustion and cold washed over me. My vision blurred, and I collapsed onto the concrete, passing out to the deafening roar of the pumps. When I opened my eyes, the sun was shining. The 3-day storm had finally broken. I was lying in a bed at the county clinic, an IV drip in my hand. The whole town was out on the levee, pointing down at the fields. The water was gone, revealing the green and gold corn stalks, bent but not broken, saved. The pumps were still running, a steady hum in the distance. Leanne was asleep in a chair next to my bed, her head resting on the mattress. She had dark circles under her eyes. When I moved, she started awake. Seeing I was conscious, she burst into tears and grabbed my hand. She told me the news. The surgery had been a success. The doctors at the regional hospital had operated on my mother through the night, thanks to the money I had sent. The infection was cleared, and she was out of danger, recovering in the hospital. Hearing that my mother was safe, that the desperate gamble with my own life had paid off, a strange tightness filled my throat. I, a soldier who had faced so much without emotion, felt a single, hot tear roll down my cheek. It was the tear of 1,000-pound weight being lifted from my soul. Later that day, the co-op chairman and a few other town officials came to my room. The chairman, stripped of his usual arrogance, was subdued. He placed a bag with a pound of sugar and a can of condensed milk on the bedside table. The electricians who came with him were full of professional respect. They told me they had gone to inspect the splice that morning and had seen the burnt, blackened wrench, still clamped tight around the copper cables, wrapped in melted rubber, hanging from the fence post. It was, they said, a crazy, brilliant piece of field engineering that none of them would have dared to attempt. The chairman cleared his throat and offered me a promotion, head of the new electrical and mechanical division of the co-op, a raise, better benefits, a bigger ration of supplies. I pushed myself up in the bed, pulled the IV from my hand, and calmly refused. Citing my health and the need to care for my mother, I told him I was quitting, effective immediately. I took the back pay he offered, and as soon as I was discharged, Leanne and I walked home. Quitting the co-op meant giving up our only steady source of income. I spent 2 days at home, recovering from hypothermia and exhaustion, my mind racing. I looked at the old tools I had brought home from the workshop. I decided to open my own repair shop. I had the skills. The only thing I lacked was the capital to buy the necessary equipment: a welder, a grinder, a proper anvil. Leanne understood. That afternoon, she went quietly into our bedroom. From the bottom of her old wooden chest, she pulled out a small red velvet box. Inside, nestled on a bed of satin, was a pair of small 2-carat gold earrings. They were her only real possession, a secret gift from her mother on her wedding day, for an emergency. She knew the old Singer sewing machine was our only source of income for now, so she would keep that. She wrapped the box of earrings in a handkerchief and said she was going to the county seat to buy more thread. Once there, she went straight to a pawn shop. She came home with a wad of cash and pressed it into my hand. "Use this," she said with a smile. "Start our future." With the money, I took a bus to the city and scoured the flea markets and scrapyards. I came back with a 150-pound anvil, a heavy-duty bench vise, a set of Soviet-made metric wrenches, a hand-crank drill press, and a gasoline-powered brazing torch. I leveled a patch of ground in our front yard, set up some posts, and stretched a tarp for a roof. Together, my wife and I built a small forge out of cinder blocks. I found an old piece of wood, painted the words "Stone and Sawn Repair" in red, and nailed it to the big oak tree at the end of our drive. At first, the work was small. Neighbors brought me broken fans, dented pots, bent bicycle frames. I did good work, charged fair prices, and slowly, my reputation grew. Word spread. Soon, people were bringing me their broken water pumps, their grain augers, even their tractors. Our business, born from sweat and the daily clang of a hammer on an anvil, began to take shape. By the time the stormy season of 1988 rolled around, Stone and Son Repair was a different place. The dirt yard was now a smooth concrete slab. The tattered tarp had been replaced by a sturdy steel frame with a corrugated tin roof. The yard was always cluttered with farm machinery waiting for repair. My reputation for quality work brought in jobs from all over the county. Meanwhile, the co-op workshop, under Tuan's mismanagement, was falling apart. The equipment was rusty, and most of the good mechanics had quit. My success was a constant, bitter reminder of his own failure. One afternoon, a lumber yard from the next county brought me a massive, 3-phase industrial table saw to repair. It weighed over 300 pounds, with a cast-iron body and a motor that had shorted out from sawdust getting into the bearings. I told them I'd have it ready in 3 days. I spent a full day disassembling it, chipping out the old, burnt copper windings and rewinding the stator with new wire. I reassembled the whole thing and left it in the middle of the shop, ready for a test run the next morning. That night, Tuan snuck onto my property. He knew I had a habit of leaving large projects out in the workshop instead of trying to haul them into the house. By the dim light of the moon, he crept to the table saw. He opened the motor's electrical junction box. With a pair of wire cutters, he snipped the green ground wire that connected the motor to the cast-iron frame. Then, he loosened the screw on the terminal for one of the 3 80-volt hot leads and bent the bare copper wire so it was just touching the metal casing of the saw. He had set a deadly trap. He tightened the cover back on, leaving no trace. His plan was simple. When I powered up the saw, the live current would energize the entire metal body of the machine. With the ground wire cut, there was no safe path for the electricity to escape. The moment I touched any part of the saw, even the hand crank to raise the blade, my body would become the ground. The high-voltage current would pass through me, stopping my heart. It was a perfect murder, disguised as a tragic workshop accident. Tuan slipped away into the darkness, leaving the silent machine waiting for its victim. The next morning, I woke up early to test the saw before the client arrived. The massive cast-iron machine sat on the concrete floor, its blade freshly greased. My routine was always the same. Connect the power, then run the motor without a load to check the speed and blade rotation. I picked up the heavy 4-core power cable and walked towards the saw. As I knelt to open the junction box, my years of training as a combat engineer made me pause. Something was wrong. My eyes were drawn to the 4 screws holding the junction box cover. 3 of them were coated in a fine layer of old sawdust, but the 4th screw, in the bottom right corner, was clean, almost shiny. The paint around its edge was chipped, and the Phillips head slot had a fresh metallic scratch. It was undeniable proof. Someone had opened this box, and recently, I put the power cable down. I didn't connect it. Instead, I took my own screwdriver and carefully removed all 4 screws. I lifted the cover. Inside, I immediately saw the deadly alteration. The bare wire from the L1 phase terminal had been bent at a sharp angle, pressing directly against the inside wall of the metal box, and the green ground wire, which should have been securely fastened to the frame, was cut clean through, its end tucked away out of sight. The trap was laid bare. If I had been in a hurry, if I hadn't noticed that one clean screw, I would have connected the power and touched the saw. My body would have completed the circuit, and the 380 volts would have killed me instantly. I knew with absolute certainty who had done this. I took my needle-nose pliers and carefully bent the hot wire back into its proper position, ensuring a safe clearance from the metal casing. I stripped a fresh section of the ground wire and secured it tightly to the grounding screw on the frame. Then, I took out my multimeter, set it to measure resistance, and tested for any current leaks between the power leads and the frame. The needle didn't move. The machine was properly insulated. I connected the power cable and threw the breaker. The motor whirred to life, the blades spinning with a satisfying, high-pitched scream. The death trap had been disarmed by caution, and a lifetime of paying attention to the details. A few days later, with his murder plot foiled, Tuan's world completely collapsed. The co-op workshop was officially shut down due to bankruptcy. His own father disowned him after discovering he had been embezzling funds. Desperate and consumed by hatred, Tuan used the last of his money to hire 3 thugs from the city. Their plan was simple: burn my workshop to the ground. I got a tip from an old army buddy who drove a delivery truck and had overheard them talking. Tuan had planned the attack for a stormy night at the end of August, hoping the rain would cover their tramarde and hinder any attempt to fight the fire. I knew who was coming, but I didn't call the sheriff. I had no proof. That afternoon, as the sky darkened and the wind began to howl, I told my mother and Leanne that I was going to be using some toxic chemicals in the shop and that it was best if they spent the night with our neighbors, whose new brick house was much sturdier than ours. Alone in the workshop, I locked the gate and began to prepare my own reception. First, I needed to neutralize the threat of gasoline. I took a small, single-phase water pump I had salvaged from an old well and connected its intake to the large cistern under my workshop. I ran a PVC pipe from the pump's output up to the rafters, snaking it across the ceiling. Every 3 feet, I drilled a small hole in the pipe. When the pump was activated, it would create a makeshift sprinkler system, soaking the entire workshop floor and everything in it. Gasoline, diluted with that much water on a wet surface, would be nearly impossible to ignite. Next came the main event. I took a heavy-duty 1.2-volt truck battery and placed it on a dry wooden table in the corner. Next to it, I mounted an ignition coil from a motorcycle. An ignition coil is a step-up transformer. When you feed it a pulsating 1.2-volt DC current, its secondary coil generates thousands of volts, but at a very low, non-lethal amperage. It's enough to deliver a massive shock, to paralyze muscles and overwhelm the nervous system, but not enough to kill. To deliver the shock, I needed a grid. I laid a large, thick rubber mat cut from an old piece of conveyor belt on the dry concrete just inside the workshop entrance. On top of the rubber mat, I spread out a large section of chain-link fence. I connected the high-voltage output of the ignition coil to the edge of the chain-link fence. I ran a wire from the negative terminal of the battery to a long copper rod, driven deep into the earth outside, completing the circuit. The rubber mat acted as a perfect insulator, allowing the chain-link fence to be charged with thousands of volts without the electricity discharging into the ground. The trap was set. The only way the circuit could be completed was if someone, standing on the wet ground outside, stepped onto the fence. Their body would become the conductor. I ran the switches for the water pump and the ignition coil to a hiding spot behind a pile of scrap metal. I turned off all the lights and waited in the darkness. Around midnight, the storm hit with full force. Rain hammered on the tin roof, and the thunder was deafening. Through the sheets of rain, I saw 3 figures in cheap plastic ponchos appear at my gate. One of them kicked the gate hard. I had deliberately left it unlatched. The gate swung open, and the 3 men, armed with tire irons, swaggered into the yard. The last man was carrying a 5-gallon gas can. He unscrewed the cap and began sloshing gasoline all over the machinery and the concrete floor. From my hiding place, I flipped the switch for the water pump. The quiet hum of the motor was lost in the sound of the storm. A moment later, dozens of fine jets of water sprayed down from the ceiling. The water instantly soaked everything, diluting the gasoline and washing it away into the drainage channels. The man with the gas can fumbled with a Zippo lighter, but the flint was soaked, and it wouldn't spark. The fire threat was neutralized. Furious that their plan had failed, the 3 men dropped the gas can and advanced towards the workshop entrance, their tire irons raised. The moment their wet boots stepped onto the chain-link fence, I threw the second switch. The 1-2-volt current from the battery pulsed through a relay, hit the ignition coil. Thousands of volts surged into the metal grid under their feet. Their wet bodies completed the circuit. The shock hit them instantly. Their muscles contracted violently, their limbs jerking uncontrollably. The tire irons clattered to the floor. They collapsed in a heap, their bodies convulsing, completely incapacitated. I held the switch down for a full 10 seconds, then let it go. I stepped out from my hiding place and turned on the main floodlight, bathing the yard in brilliant light. The 3 thugs lay twitching on the ground, gasping for air. I took a handful of heavy-duty zip ties from my pocket and quickly and efficiently bound their hands and feet. With the intruders secured, I ran to the end of the drive and flagged down the local sheriff's deputy, who was on patrol because of the storm. That same night, based on the immediate confession of the 3 hired thugs, Tuan was arrested at his home. The story of the foiled arson attempt and the electric trap became a local legend. Tuan and his accomplices confessed to everything, and they were sentenced to prison. The old co-op chairman, shamed by his son's actions, retired and moved away. After that night, the reputation of Stone and Son Repair was solidified. People respected not only my skill but my quiet strength. The business boomed. I hired 5 young men from the town as apprentices, teaching them everything I knew. By 1989, I had saved enough money to buy 3 acres of land on the main county road. We spent 6 months filling and grading the land, and I built a new, much larger workshop. It had a reinforced concrete foundation, a chain hoist gantry crane for lifting heavy engines, and brand new welding and machining equipment. My little shop became one of the largest and most respected service centers in the state, providing good jobs for dozens of local people. In the dry season of 1991, I hired a crew to tear down the old, leaky house where I had grown up. On that same piece of land, we built a new home, a sprawling, single-story ranch house with a deep foundation and a solid frame. It had polished hardwood floors, a roof with brand new shingles, and big windows that let in the light. My mother had the largest bedroom with a view of the garden. Her health had completely recovered since the surgery, and she spent her days tending to her flowers. The house stood as a proud testament to how far we had come. On New Year's Eve, 1991, the air outside was cold, but our new home was filled with warmth. Lien was 7 months pregnant, her face glowing with happiness. On the stove, a large pot of beef stew simmered, its rich aroma filling the kitchen. My mother sat in her rocking chair, smiling as she watched Lien set the table for our holiday dinner. I helped my wife carry the food to the table: a roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, and freshly baked bread. After we said grace, the 3 of us sat down to eat, our laughter filling the warm room, washing away the fatigue of a long year of hard work. After dinner, as we sat by the fire, Lien went to the bedroom and returned with a small, intricately carved wooden box. She placed it on the table and opened it. Inside, on a bed of red velvet, were 3 simple objects. She took them out one by one and placed them in front of me. The first was a tattered $5 bill, torn in half and taped together with yellowed, cloudy tape. The second was my old, chipped veteran's pin, its red enamel faded. The last was a short piece of thick, copper electrical cable, its insulation burnt and melted. Looking at these simple things, the memories of our long struggle came flooding back. The torn $5 bill, our entire fortune on the night my mother almost died. The chipped pin, a symbol of the discipline and perseverance that had seen me through the darkest times. And the burnt cable, a relic from the stormy night I had gambled my life to save hers. I took Leon's hand in mine. Just then, the baby kicked, a strong, sudden movement, as if to remind us of its presence. There were no tears, no talk of the hardships of the past. We just looked at each other and smiled. The 3 keepsakes were placed back in their box. Outside, the neighborhood kids began to set off firecrackers, their happy pops and crackles heralding the arrival of the new year. Our long journey from the depths of poverty, paid for with sweat, blood, and skill, was over. A new, brighter chapter of our lives had just begun.